Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the UX Research Rundown podcast. My name is Henrik. I am the CEO of Lookback and your host for this show, which is now in our third season. And we have changed subject. This used to be about how do you get your team along on the journey that is research. Still super relevant, but this season we're talking about AI in all its forms and research. And as always, we're going to have some great guests, and today is no exception. With me today, I have Savina Hawkins, who is a researcher at Meta, working a lot with AI in all its different forms. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Cool. So per ancient tradition now in our third season, we always start with kind of the origin story of our guest. So if you could please just tell us a little bit about how you got into research and how you ended up in AI, and how have we now, what has led to us being here today?
Absolutely. Honestly, it's a little bit of a hard story to tell because it's really not linear. I've just been a interdisciplinary person and a just lover of learning my whole life. And so even when I was a kid, I was doing things like learning how to code programs in BASIC, getting really into videography, creative writing. I had all of these different passions that were kind of pulling me in different directions. By the time I got to undergrad, I actually got my start in research working in an academic psychology lab. So designed, research projects using eye trackers to study something called negation, which is a language learning ability where children basically understand the non-existence of something, which has huge ramifications for consciousness. So right up my alley, super fascinating. And that's really how I discovered I loved research. But at the same time, I also discovered I didn't like academia, not because, I don't like it more broadly, but more just it didn't quite move fast enough. And it didn't incorporate enough of my other skill sets. So I was really lucky when I found UX research. It really just was this sort of synthesis of everything I cared about, from building to technology, even things like writing is such a huge part of our career. So it really brought all the pieces together for me. And then how it merged with AI. So I went to Stanford for undergraduate, and Stanford is just so steeped in Silicon Valley culture. AI is something that everyone was talking about. You couldn't even take a creative writing class without somehow ending up talking about AI. So it was just so relevant and top of mind. I ended up studying it quite a bit and ended up at Stanford making my own major that actually allowed me to study artificial intelligence from the humanistic perspective, which is not something that exists as sort of an off-the-shelf major at that point. And then went on to extend that program into a graduate program at Harvard School of Design, where I actually deepened that even further. And I would say it's really at the intersection of, consciousness, what it means to be human, and sort of the cutting edge of technology, really that interests me the most. And I've been super lucky to be able to actually just follow my passions and, passion for learning that has led me to this place.
Oh, cool. Okay, so that's so interesting. So consciousness. So I have to ask: are these models close to something that resembles consciousness?
Yeah. What's funny is I was at a literary salon on intellect last week called Breakthroughs in Consciousness, and I think the main takeaway is that consciousness doesn't really have a good description. If you ask thousands of people, everyone's going to tell you a slightly different answer to what consciousness is. And so, if consciousness is just the ability if free will, like being able to decide what you're going to do next, we now have things called AI agents, which do exercise a form of free will where they think for themselves and decide how they're going to act given certain context and information that they have at their disposal. So all of this sort of, cutting edge of technology is really, really problematizing, what it means to be human, what consciousness is, what's distinctly human, and sort of that boundary between the artificial and, the intelligence that nature designed is kind of very blurry and nebulous. So I've loved kind of poking into, what that boundary means.
Awesome. Yeah, I felt a little bit like I was becoming an AI the other day. I was watching a Christmas movie with my kid, and I'd never seen the Christmas movie before, but because they're all the same, I could kind of predict it. And she's like, "Stop it, how are you doing that?" And I'm like, "I don't know, I'm just doing like next word prediction on like something based on all the stuff I've consumed." So I don't know, all of this stuff is so interesting, I think. So I don't know what it means to kind of have all of that that seems to be a very kind of obviously you're summarizing a deep academic background in just like a few minutes here, but as someone who's been working with these questions for a long time, and gotten pretty deep into it, I guess, then what have been the biggest kind of surprises, and what have you learned from this technology on kind of compared to your academic, how we thought it used to be, the models basically, like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked in different AI labs, and that's, given me a really wonderful vantage point where I've been able to work directly with folks who are working on the breakthrough. So those AI research scientists and AI engineers. And then also, I come from such a humanistic background. I've always contemplated, what does this mean? What's the big picture? How does this impact humanity sort of at the same time? So it's been a really, fun career being able to sort of bridge the gap between those two things. I would say I had several major kind of, oh my gosh, AI is even better than I expected it to be, and it's happening even sooner than expected. The first thing that absolutely blew my mind is Meta was working on this paper, and this is all open source, so nothing private here. They were working on developing AI that could use other tools by writing their own API queries. So for folks who don't know what an API query is, it's basically how two computers talk to each other and send information back and forth. And the query itself that is sent through the API is sort of a message to, hey, can I have this information? Or, hey, can you do this thing for me? It's you could think of it as almost talking to a waiter in a restaurant and ordering something off a menu, or asking them to use something, like ketchup from the kitchen. So that's what an API is. And what the research scientists were doing was taking the ability to write API queries, so make demands of other tools, and extend it to AI. So AI actually could write its own queries and use other tools. Right. And as someone who's super nerdy and deep in the academic stuff, a lot of humanity and what makes us who we are has been built off of this idea that we are the tool users. That is who we are. It's literally called homo faber. There's like a full-on word for this in philosophy. And what's just fascinating about it is if the tools we are making themselves are able to autonomously use tools, what does that mean about who we are? What is our utility to the world? And how are we going to kind of fit into this broader landscape in which so much more of the things that we do and we base our career around are going to be, done much more faster and much more accurately by AI. Right. So that was definitely a big moment. And I think another wow moment was GPT-3. So of course, everyone knows GPT-4 and all of those big large language models. But that GPT-3, especially 3.5, was really this huge step change in the output quality that you really, really could see. In fact, OpenAI also did a reinforcement learning batch on top of some of these other models. And once I believe it was called Instruct GPT, which they just folded into the prior models. But that made it so steerable and so accurate and just so precise with how it was mobilizing language. At a certain point, I was like, wow, this is, I grew up loving writing. This is going to be a way better writer than I possibly could ever be. So,
yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to have autonomous kind of authors, AI authors that just like produce books, not out of their own will perhaps, but because that's what they do? Or like, how should we think about that?
Unquestionably. And so I think that what changes is what it means to author something. So I absolutely believe that, for example, think about academia. All of academia is sort of researching, reviewing existing materials, coming up with interesting hypotheses, and then going and producing new knowledge that answers questions that we don't have answers to. And that is something that absolutely could be done by an AI, and actually probably significantly faster. They could explore multiple hypotheses at the same time, gather data against them across, the whole corpora of materials in academia that, of course, a human, if they were going to try and read that much information, it would take them like years. So that to me is absolutely, we're going to see a lot of autonomous agents emerging, multi-agent systems that all interact with each other and are able to produce outputs that's, maybe on par with what a team of humans would do. That's sort of what a multi-agent system is. But when it comes to things like art, I'm a big believer in that, real good art comes from that specifically human place. It's very connected to consciousness and all of this stuff. And so, yes, AI can make art. It can write works of fiction. It can do all these different things. But if it doesn't have that sort of spark that humans have, that makes us who we are, then there's sort of a gap there, I think. Yeah.
So not poetry, but like
well, I mean, it definitely
fiction.
can write poetry. It's a better poet than me for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Okay, cool. So this is all very interesting. And what I've learned doing these interviews for the podcast is that, I mean, I kind of knew this intellectually that like there was a field of like, machine learning and some of this is didn't just like start with, the ChatGPT 3 moment. But I think I've realized how incredibly rich it was compared to how little I think the outside world kind of knew about everything that was going on before this moment. Like now everyone knows that there's some AI going on, right? So for most of the research community, I think that most people have started thinking intensely about this stuff in just the last 6 months or something like that, perhaps something like that. What would you say, because you've had a head start, like what are the kind of the now in these 6 months where people are trying to grasp just what is this, like what have you learned about what it means to UX research and to our field and to tooling and to kind of all the different things that go into being a researcher?
Yeah, so I
Big question, but yeah.
No, I mean, I've thought a lot about it. I think that probably every user researcher at some moment in time over the next 5 years will probably transition into helping existing products evolve how the workflows work, how the experience functions to better leverage AI so that at every moment of using a product, every moment of the experience is actually enhanced by this superior technology that's suddenly available. I kind of think it is, a good metaphorical comparison is the internet. And so you can imagine there are plenty of businesses existed before the internet, and they had existing systems set up for how they were operating without the internet. And then, of course, when the internet came, it was this massive revolution where, small businesses, big businesses, everyone had to reimagine what they were doing, their operations model, the product that they were offering, given this new world. And I think we're again in one of those transition points. And UXR is exactly what's needed because we have the skills to basically triage between what can the technology do, what's possible, and what do people want? What's a meaningful improvement that's not just, here's a few ideas that ChatGPT brainstormed. Because if you notice, if you kind of look across the product landscape right now, a lot of the functionality that people are embedding is not super, super imaginative yet, because we're really in those early phases of people just trying to figure out how to put, infuse large language models and, predictive analytics into their products. But I think we're just going to get a ton of creativity. And I believe a lot of it will come from designers and UXRs for how we can leverage these technologies in more unique ways.
Yeah, because you have to put it in a product, in a workflow that actually enhances something for it to really... It's almost like, I don't know, I'm an economist by training and often think about like what do supply, like what does it do to stuff? And it's so interesting when you get a new resource, it's like, oh, it's so cool, right? But very quickly it just becomes like abundant. And then you realize that what really matters is like, out of all of this like abundant resource mass, what is it you want? Like, what is the goal, right? And it's going to be exciting to see how quickly because there's definitely the hype, if you know what I mean, of kind of all of these things that we can do, but the kind of the understanding what of all of this that humans actually find useful, I think is a great field for research to really understand, like is it going to anyway, a little bit of a ramble on kind of what I think that means.
I love that. Yeah. What it makes me think of also is I was chatting with some really excellent research practitioners, I guess, work in semiotics for the most part and sort of brand marketing. And we had this conversation about, should UX researchers use AI in their practice? What are the downsides of doing that? And this was, way back quite a few months ago. So I was still really early in my thinking about this. But I mentioned to them, well, the way I think about it is it's as if, think about washing machines. Do you really want to wash your hands by hand? Like, no, right? And then I said this to him, and what he said back to me is, well, hand washing is a meditative state, and there's actually kind of a beauty that emerges from doing something by hand. So I think that that aspect of our practice where UX research has both a sort of science piece and an art piece. And I think definitely finding a way to make the things that are in the science camp faster so you can get to something that's substantiated, rigorous, accurate, faster than you would be able to using, human capabilities of how fast we can read, how fast we can think. Sort of pairing that also with the idea that there is definitely a lot of art in how you position things to stakeholders. What insights do you pull out and why are they important? How do you phrase something so that it's going to really impact the organization? And I think, I hope in the future we find a way to sort of negotiate that so that the art is brought to the forefront.
Yeah. It makes me think of, and I'd love to have your perspective on this because it might just be me getting older, right? But when I started out in research, like academic research way back when, and I did my analysis in spreadsheets and stuff like that, before we had any of those fancy ways to just calculate this stuff, right? It wasn't like punch cards, but it was it was early, right? And there's something in the hands-on work, in the details of working in a spreadsheet that taught me a lot about analytics and all that stuff. So it's not just meditative; it's also like you're in the kind of details of the work, and you can see the same thing with like some of the best developers I know are the ones that are they were so early that they had to work like all the way from machine language, like all the way up to the interface, and they kind of truly understand the whole kind of stack, right? And I wonder if there's something like that in UX research too, where there's a risk that we become too distant from the methods that we lose kind of connection with the art somehow. I don't know if that's just me, it was better in my day or something, or what do you think about that?
No, I think so. First, where my brain is going is every time a new technology comes out, that's usually the reaction that humanity has. So if you think back to the book, when the book came out, it's when the TV came out, people were worried that we wouldn't be able to develop our imaginations if the TV was doing all the work that normally your brain is doing when you read a book. So that type of thinking, I think we hit that every time there's a new technology that's released, because it forces us to rethink and adapt how we're doing anything with this new sort of, state-of-the-art equipment. So then the other thing that it really makes me think about, I'm trying to think of how to say this. In my master's program, I studied a lot of Heidegger, who I have mixed feelings about, but the main takeaway there is that tools are things you can either think with and think through, or they're things that do the thinking for you, and you're sort of reporting back to you, and you then are sort of the master of the information. And I think those two dynamics are really interesting because when you're doing something by hand, you are doing every piece of the thinking. You're figuring out the concepts, you're thinking through things logically, you're manipulating the data by hand so you really can see what patterns match to other things. And I think there's a huge value in training critical thinking skills from doing that. So I think our schools right now completely getting rid of essay prompts because people can just give it to ChatGPT and I say, hey, ChatGPT, write my essay about, like a Beowulf or something. But yes, I'm hoping that we still get the critical thinking skills developed, because I think a lot of this stuff is really crucial skills and abilities for sure.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me, I didn't plan for this, but it's actually a pretty good segue. So, you've given a few talks where you've been talking about what, for me, that's kind of world building. I know that you have a better term for it now. That thinking has evolved a little bit, but this goes back to like, what is our responsibility and role in kind of the choices we make and how we interact with these tools a little bit. I know that you've kind of thought about this in structured ways, and I'd love to hear your kind of latest version of this thinking.
Yeah. So I guess world building is something that I've been. It's weirdly been following me all throughout my academic journey. So it's been sort of top of mind, and also probably why I work in UX research. Out of any field, UX research and tech literally shapes humanity's interactions with each other, with
Mm.
tooling more broadly, and to some degree actually structures our social interpersonal reality. And because it's that prevalent and that entrenched into the human experience, whenever a UX researcher studies that interaction, and then articulates what a company should do, they're actually basically making an argument about the world that should exist because of this information. And
Mm.
actually, that is exactly why, going back to my academic days, I loved research, but in academia, you don't get to say this is what should happen. This is how the world should be.
Yeah.
Academia is purely about discovering or, articulating a truth that already theoretically should exist. So with UX research, you really do get to have a stance on what should happen, and that's a really powerful thing to be able to influence the world and human experience at that kind of level. It's a beautiful thing. So I think what you were saying earlier about the terminology is so up for grabs at this point. But I think of it, I think instead of world building, that loses some of the thought and critical thinking that goes into
Hmm.
user research work, that goes into design work. So I'm leaning towards more world designing because it really is
Yeah.
about thinking about our collective milieu, the places in which we exist, the technologies that structure our lives. Even simple things like the clock on the iPhone that goes off every morning, waking you up. All of this stuff becomes part of people's lived experiences of reality, and
Yeah.
thinking through how that should be is a really immense responsibility.
Yeah. I love that development because I've been thinking a lot about how UX research fits into workflow with like people that actually build things like code stuff or build hardware or something like that,
Mhm.
which is not what UX research does, right? It's more design thinking. What was it you said? It's about thinking how it should be, studying it, realizing how it should be, forming an hypothesis about that, and kind of promoting that to the builders in a sense, right?
Mhm.
So perhaps that becomes even more important to think pretty in the details about those distinctions.
Mm.
Yeah,
I love
I
that.
like that.
Yeah, I love that. I guess the one pushback I have is that you'd be surprised at how UX researchers, when they get outside of their comfort zone, so our comfort
Hmm.
zone is working with design and product. Those are
Yeah.
kind of our people. We're used to talking with them. We know the language they speak, what's important to them. And then sort of all of the people who are actually doing the building, the engineers, data scientists, that's just a little outside of UX research comfort zone. So we don't really tend to engage with them as much as we should.
Yeah.
As someone who, I'm an interdisciplinary mixed methods researcher, so I can do things like analyze data in R and write a SQL query, and all of this
Yeah.
sort of, I call it like data science 101 skill set because
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
I'm not a data scientist, but I at least know enough to get by, being able to piece things together and continue the research process. But basically, if you can break down the barriers between the people doing the thinking about what should happen and the people doing the building, that's really where the
Hmm.
magic happens. Because, for example, I've worked on teams where AI researchers were building this really expensive model, investing a lot of time and attention into training it to do this one specific thing. And
Yeah.
then, UX researcher interacts with it and just sees, oh, that's interesting. Why are the inputs and outputs structured this way? Wouldn't it actually be better if the output was more like this? Or it was, and those little tweaks for how we can actually participate in the literal design of the AI algorithms are super
Yeah.
meaningful, especially when we can participate in that. We are shaping things that's like the most kind of central place you can make an impact as a researcher because everything else flows from whatever is built in the back end and the
Yeah.
capabilities that the AI models have. So I definitely
Yeah.
think user researchers will work more in that going forward for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This is why I've been thinking about this, because you should have been on the last season too, because when we were talking about like how to get your team along on the journey that is research, right? And that by implication, how to get researchers into early into building also, right? So this is something that I've been interviewing a lot of engineers lately for the stuff that we're building, because we kind of figured out the thing, like how do we make non-researchers feel welcome in a research session and interacting, you know? But one of them, my CTO actually that I was talking to about this, he felt like, yeah, I love being there and I love like seeing all the stuff, but I always feel like an afterthought because I'm always like invited and something has already been decided. I'm like, oh my God, you should get in earlier, you know, so we can like, how do we make that happen, right? Because I totally agree. And I think that these are super interesting problems. And I think it connects to, AI lends itself, it was going to make it much easier to create some of these connections at the right places without forcing people out of their workflows. You know, these LLMs are really good at picking up like, hey, there was a conversation over here, like this person should see this thing and whatever. So I think there's a lot of super interesting tooling coming there. But
no, completely agree. And I think one tip or technique that's worked really well for me in the past. So when talking with technical people, they sort of own the domain of what's possible. And you as a user researcher or, someone who's sort of thinking in the design world, you really own like what should be. But what can be lives at the intersection of those two things. So you have to then do some negotiation. And sometimes I actually do this by starting at the, I use this technique called design fiction. It's not a common user research practice. It's not as common as it should be, but it allows you to kind of skip quite a few years into the future, figure out what does the long-term solution look like? What is the absolute ideal if we solved exactly what the customer wants? What does that experience look like end to end, and articulate that? And then often you can actually work backwards from there for what's possible today. What would be the sort of incremental steps towards that? And I even use often the metaphor of, evolution, where, you start with single cell life forms and then it gets more and more complex over time.
right.
Building and designing these sort of moments of, evolutionary step change to get you towards the big vision, I think is another thing that UX researchers should be participating in, because it really is influential for product roadmaps.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is, I love this stuff. And again, an area where LLMs can, in particular, can really help. Because a lot of this is about transparency, right? These discussions do take place. I don't know if it's specifically that, but this kind of thinking takes place. But the right people might not always be in the room, and some of these things are not very planned either. They're just like, we're talking. I had no idea we were going to start talking about this. Perhaps you knew, right? But I had no idea, right? Super interesting. If we had known about, let's say that we were working on a product now instead of recording a podcast. Like this would be a moment where we would be like, probably, oh, this person should have been here for this, right? We didn't know. If we had known, we would have invited them, and this would have been even better. But we didn't know, right? And this is where I think a lot of kind of like, let's say an LLM is listening to this and like kind of just picking up on some of these things. You can do a lot of stuff to really, bring people in across the whole kind of process, because the process, as you said, isn't linear at all. It's just this craziness. I don't know what even to call it. So I'm super excited. Am I too excited about LLMs?
It's okay. I am always too excited about LLMs. So he's space here. Be as excited as you want to be. It'll allow me to be excited, which is good.
Cool. But so to reformulate that, so what would you say are kind of because you talked a little bit about like some moments you had when you were like, oh my God, this is even better than we ever thought. Like, what are some of the limitations that you see, and kind of how hard will those be to overcome in your mind? Because I'll give you one example of the kind of hallucinating models and stuff like that. That's something that people are like, oh, they're hallucinating, we can't use it for this. And I'm like, oh, they're gonna fix that. Like, I don't know, am I right? Like,
You're right. They are on track to fix that. So I would say in the AI field is moving so fast that if you basically aren't just following it week over week, you're gonna be way behind. It's the equivalent of being years behind in the discourse because of how fast it's moving. Right. But definitely hallucinations, that is something that we're the field is working on fixing. Really any limitation that AI has right now, except for its ability to sort of interface with what's real in the world, which is, we're going to have to build sensors for that. There's always limitations for, humans are embodied in a world, they can sense their environment. That's how nature built us to function. Versus AI is very kind of abstract and disembodied. There's no kind of place where it exists. There's no sort of central point where all the information is coming together like it does with the human subjective experience. We're actually building that. We have to build that for the AI, in fact, which again gets into the world designing piece. But yeah, it's crazy to think about.
Okay, so you're also an optimist here, I see. So either we're both right or we're both crazy. Who knows?
Well, yeah. I don't know if you've seen that meme that's about it's the different dispositions you can have politically towards AI. And I think any one of the quadrants, so there's the techno-optimists, I think even the joke meme is let's build the AI god, and all of these other, there's like people who are very fearful of AI and want to slow it down. I think that all is very fascinating, and it just reminds me of how complex this dance is, where we are such an important part of this conversation, we user researchers, because we provide the pacing required to move slowly and think things thoroughly, even if the impetus is you must still move fast. So I think that's sort of what we're faced with as a field moving forward, and I think we'll have to adapt to this new context, because it is a new context. Things are just going to get built a lot faster. It's going to change. PRDs can be created on the fly by AI, or you could be in a conversation with a customer and they're describing their ideal solution, and AI is making a wireframes in real time to show the customer what that looks like. All of that is going to be possible, and I would expect within the next year and a half. So the change is coming, and it's effectively inevitable at this point. We really do need to figure out how we'll adapt our practice and how we'll also stay true to our underlying values.
Yeah, right. So how would you, to get super practical on that, how do you, that sounds like a bit of a paradox to me, that on the one hand, it moves so fast that we just have to kind of like spend our time just keeping up to date with what's happening, and like nothing that we think are limitations now will actually be limitations in whatever 3 months on the one hand. And the other one is like, well, we're supposed to play this kind of like active role in this as world builders, world designers, and I have nothing against a good paradox like that. It sounds very exciting to me, but like how do you manage that as a researcher, trying to take both of those seriously? How do you do that in your day-to-day practice?
What it reminds me of is the paradox we're already managing pretty well, I think, is the complexity of stakeholder management, where everyone has something completely different that they care about. Their world has their information in it, and they're pretty isolated and separated. So if you're, making a presentation about, I don't know, sales calls lost and the patterns that you came up with, you're going to present something to the sales team. You also present something pretty different to the marketing team and something pretty different to the product team, because it's what information sort of fits into what they already know about the world that will actually be useful for them. So even that is a paradox, because research, hopefully creates something that's, I put in air quotations because what really is truth, but it's aiming to create some sort of truth or substantiated knowledge. And then the paradox we deal with is other people don't want to spend the time that we spend engaging with what should be, thinking through all the nuances. They just want to consume what's most important to them. So we've already figured out how to navigate that in our environment and how our role is set up pretty well. So I would expect that those same skills that got us to solve that problem can also be applied to solving this problem, which again, I guess maybe is a little bit unfair that we have to take this burden on our backs. But I think being the critical thinker at the table, taking the time to do the extra thinking and think through, what are the potential downfalls of this? What are the consequences that would be bad? Are there ways that it could be better? Are there assumptions that are baked into how we're thinking about the problem that are just assumptions that are left over from Web 2.0 that don't even apply anymore?
Right.
If we have the ability to kind of think through all of those details and then do that same thing we normally do, research our stakeholders, what they care about and what they need, you still can position the I guess what is going to be best for humans and best for the organization to the people who will need to act on that at the right time and in the right way. I really believe that we'll be able to do that going forward.
Okay, super cool. So now we've reached that point in the podcast where we could go on for hours. That's how I feel about it anyway. But we have to start moving towards the end. So I have one final question. I think might be more final questions, but we'll see. So do you think that we'll have AI stakeholders shortly as researchers?
Interesting. And when you say stakeholder, what type of stakeholder?
How about someone that you kind of report your research findings to?
Yeah, I mean, well,
and how would you do that? Like prompt writing or like what?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing is research repositories are really hard to build correctly right now. And a lot of teams have tried to cobble together solutions to make something that would work. But what we really want, so doing that thing where you think way out in advance, what you really want is sort of a centralized brain for the organization that knows who your customer is, knows what your product is, what it does, and then knows how to create the links between different research projects, both to expose what are our knowledge gaps that the research team can close, and then also help us resurface things that are relevant from the past so that we can be more effective in figuring out things in the future. I think of it kind of the academic knowledge production process starts always with, what do we already know? How do we come to know it? What are the pitfalls with that information? And I think we do a lot of that thinking too. And it's super valuable that someone at the organization is doing it. But of course, a lot of that is being done manually. It's like manual knowledge work. And I think in the future, it likely will be at least somewhat automated, if not fully automated. And if fully automated, that begets a question of what will our roles become in the future.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I mean, we've done a lot of research into repositories. So this is one of the cool things about my job. I get to do research on researchers about research, which is super cool. But we did a huge project on like repositories and no shade on any repositories out there. But like the conclusion of the project was like, repositories are where research goes to die, and it's like a bit harsh. It's a bit harsh, but that was kind of like that's what my researcher told me, like, too long didn't read, repositories are where research goes to die, right? And again, like this is a hard problem. Nothing against any repository tools out there, but I can see how that works because basically everyone is in the moment, everyone is coming up with the insights, and then they go somewhere, and to actually like bring that back into the workflow is a significant barrier, a really difficult barrier. But I can totally see how, we're already starting to do some of this stuff with the LLM where it's like, hey, this seems like you already did this, or like, hey, you've already like asked this question like 50 times, like perhaps move to another question, you know what I mean? So I like this kind of the brain who is kind of like, hey Siri, have we researched this before, right? And also researchers don't, another researcher I talked to was like, I love that people are interested in research, but I hate to be like the receptionist for the library. People are always like, do we know anything about this? Do we know anything about this? Like, ask the LLM. I'm busy researching, So,
that's so true.
Okay, cool. Well, nice to invite guests and then end with a big rant, but it was your fault because you inspired me with all of your super cool learnings here. So
thank you for being okay with all the pedantic, let's talk about consciousness things that came up. If you're talking to me, I can't help it.
Oh, this is what I love so much about this podcast, and I think this is what the audience loves about the podcast. We never know what we're going to get, and I think everyone has done so much interesting work into this field and done so much thinking about everything, and it's so orienting, especially when things are moving so fast. To have someone like you come on a podcast like this and just kind of like summarize, give us a map a little bit, it's super helpful, and I know the audience is going to love it. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Awesome. So if we want to know more, should people follow you on social media? Are there some resources? Like how do people reach you after this amazing?
So AI4UXR.org is where I'm publishing updates about what's going on in AI. So I think the next blog post is most likely, the last blog post was about a mixture of experts model and why that's relevant and what that means for the future of our field. And I think the next one I'll probably touch on, world designing and all of tools to think with and all stuff like that. So that's a good good resource. I also, it's a to-do list item for me to get back on social media because
There you
I've
go.
been, for someone who currently works at Meta, I've been very absent from social media. So
Okay.
got to make an effort
Good
there.
luck with that. I'll follow you anywhere. So
Yeah,
just tell me where you are. Perfect.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Happy researching, everyone, and see you next time. Bye-bye.